Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are. Welcome to the Quantitative History Webinar series. I'm Ziwu Chen, a professor of finance and economics at the University of Hong Kong. This webinar series is organized by the University of Hong Kong Business School and also the Asia Global Institute. So today, we're very happy to have Professor Peter Koudijs. He is associate professor at the Graduate School of Business at Stanford. Currently, he's in transition to join the University of Rotterdam in the Netherlands. So today he's going to speak on a very, very interesting topic, marrying for money, which I've often seen mentioned in movies and novels. So his research will be based on evidence from the first wave of married women's property rights in the US. As we mentioned in the announcement, so Peter Koudijs is an expert in financial history, especially he has published a number of papers on this topic, including 4 centuries of stock market predictability. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Peter. Just before that, let me also quickly mention the way we are going to proceed is to let Peter talk for 1 hour, and then while he talks, you can post your questions, comments in the Q&A box. And then at the end, my colleague, Professor Zhichen Ma, will pick it up from there and moderate the Q&A session. Okay, so Peter, here you go.
Well, thanks a lot for the introduction, and thanks a lot for having me for the webinar. I'm very honored, and I'm very pleased to talk. So let me share my screen, share my slide deck. Put it in full screen. Okay, fantastic. So thanks a lot. So I've moved to the Erasmus University in Rotterdam in the Netherlands. This is joint work with Laura Salisbury, who's at York University, and this is going to be, and I'm going to talk about marrying for money. So there's a large literature out there that talks about the economic gains from marriage, and the idea is that by joining their estates, a couple can achieve better economic outcomes, and that this matters for partner choice. Now, most of the literature really focuses on the pooling of labor. So in Becker's kind of seminal study, a couple achieves better economic outcomes through the division of labor, which allows them to exploit increasing returns to skill. When you look at other contributions in the literature, most of these contributions have a labor perspective. So they would, for example, point to the more efficient provision of public goods within a marriage, or they point to risk sharing from a kind of a labor perspective. Now, the bigger goal of this paper is to say something about something that's not been really kind of studied in literature, and that's the importance of pooling of capital for the economic gains from marriage. So to what degree does the pooling of capital matter for marriage choice? And in particular, we're really going to try to answer, or what we're really asking in this paper is, how does a couple's interaction with credit markets affect the gains from marriage, and how does it affect partner choice? So the idea is as follows. So by marrying, a couple can pool its capital and basically gets more collateral to go to the credit market and obtain more credit. So that's the benefit of pooling capital. At the same time, it might be possible to write a marriage contract in such a way that the assets in the name of one partner are protected from the creditors of the other partner. And that's kind of a way for the couple to limit its liability. There's certain assets in the marriage that cannot be seized by any outside party. So this is kind of how marriage might affect the couple's interaction with credit markets. And the bigger goal, and the goal of this paper is to figure out whether this matters for partner choice. And if so, this would have much broader implications for how we think about marriage. It would mean that certain institutions that would facilitate the provision of credit and certain legal changes that would make it easier for people to limit their liability would have important impacts on the marriage market. And this could suggest that, that these issues, that this interaction with credit markets and these institutions and rules on limited liability might explain some of the evolution of marriage markets over time. So what is it that we do? What is kind of the approach that we take in this paper? So we were interested in this question, how does the interaction with credit markets affect partner choice? You would ideally have the following. You would ideally want to look at an institutional change that alters the treatment of marital property, and which then affects the gains, the economic gains from marriage in a very predictable and a very testable way. And you would want this institutional change to not alter the underlying matching technology that kind of drives how people meet each other. And you would also not want this institutional change to be correlated with other societal changes. That way you can really zoom in on this different treatment of marital property. That's kind of the ideal setting you want to look at. And what we're going to do in this paper, which I think gets us relatively close to this ideal setting, is the introduction of kind of the first wave of married women property acts in the US, and in particular in the US South, in the 1840s. So I'll tell you more about what these acts really meant, but what's important to note here is that they were introduced at the level of the individual states, and they were at the individual US state, and introduced in different years. And that will have kind of implications for how we can really empirically evaluate these channels. And then the question we ask is, how did the passage of these laws affect outcomes in the marriage market? And we're going to look at partner choice, and in particular, we're going to look at assortative mating, so the tendency of like to marry with like. So let me give you a little bit more background about these laws. So prior to the passage of a law, a woman's property basically became her husband's upon marriage. So, the woman would bring some property into the marriage. It basically became the husband's property, and creditors could easily seize it in case the husband was unable to repay his loans. Now, this changed after the passage of one of these Married Women Property Acts. If you got married, that's the important thing. If you got married after the law was changed, you got into the following situation. The husband would not own the wife's property anymore, but he would hold her property in trust and invest it for her benefit. And the plan was for this property to either be passed on to the couple's children or to be available to the family in times of distress. And in the meantime, creditors were not able to seize this property. So what did these laws really do? Well, they limited the husband's ability to borrow against the wife's property. Why? Well, this property could not be seized by creditors, so could not be used as collateral in credit markets. And at the same time, these laws provided downside protection. The wife's assets could not be seized by creditors, leaving some kind of assets in the family in case they were hit by a bad shock, effectively limiting their liability. What did not change was women's ability to contract, which basically wasn't there. Women could not contract either before or after the passage of the law. It was really the husband who decided what was being done with these assets. Now, what this law change is going to do is going to have a relatively predictable impact on credit demand and supply. This is something that Laura and I discussed and showed in a paper that we recently published in the Journal of Financial Economics. So it has a very predictable impact on credit demand and supply, and by extension has a very predictable impact on the gains from marriage. And then we can then test how this then affected the equilibrium in the marriage market. Okay, before I get into the actual analysis, let me give you a little bit more background about the American South in the 1840s. So this is really a plantation economy. 2/3 of families are operating in agriculture, according to the 1850 census. And if you look at the 1840 census, it looks like about 1/3 of households own at least one slave. So this is really a slave-based plantation economy. So it's kind of good to signal up front, whenever I talk about collateral, this also includes captive human beings who were exploited as slaves. So that's good to keep in mind. The financial system in the US South was relatively well developed at this point. So slaves and plantations were frequently used as collateral in credit transactions. So a relatively well developed credit market. And at the same time, the bankruptcy regime was relatively harsh. If you were unable to repay your debts, there was no way of getting rid of it in the future. You would always be liable to repay your debts for the remainder of your life. Some states still had debtors prison to really force you to give up all the assets that you could to satisfy creditors. All loans that were contracted for full recourse. So if you contracted a loan, you were unable to repay it, creditors could basically seize all the assets in your possession. And there were some minimal homestead exemptions. So some of the home equity people had in this period was protected, but that was relatively minimal. So this sums up to a relatively harsh bankruptcy regime. If you're unable to repay your debt, you're really in trouble. Just a quick note on inheritance and dowries. I've been talking about women's kind of property. So did women actually get anything when they got married, or did they get anything when their parents died? And the answer is yes. This is not a system of primogeniture. It's not the case that the oldest son gets everything. The standard is for parents to really share kind of their assets with all of their kids, either at death or in the case of daughters, effectively kind of a wealth transfer at the time of marriage. So it's relatively normal to convey or will property to daughters. Why do they do that? Why do they want to give property to their daughters? Well, that affects the daughter's position in the marriage market, but it's also a way to already kind of transfer your wealth to your grandchildren. So this is purely in terms of general background. Then let's move into the passage of these laws. So we're in the situation, US South, plantation economy, relatively well-developed credit markets, harsh bankruptcy laws. And then there's a really big crisis in 1837, 1839, that really affects the US South. There's a sharp drop in cotton prices, sharp drop in land prices, slave values. A lot of people are not able to repay their loans, and there's a wave of foreclosures throughout the US South. And at this point, local state governments figure out that we need to do something. You have all these families who lose all their possessions, who become really poor, and family life is really at risk, and especially the position of wives or daughters is really precarious. So Tennessee Observer in 1843 mentions that the reverses of the last few years have shown so much devastation of married women's property by the misfortunes of their husbands that some new modification of the law seems to dictate of justice as well as prudence. And in Georgia in 1843, they mentioned there's no good reason why property bequeathed to a daughter should go to pay debts of which she knew nothing, had no agency in creating, and the payment of which, with her means, would reduce her and her children to beggary. This has been done in hundreds of instances and should no longer be tolerated by the laws of the land. So the idea is these people have lost their property, they've been foreclosed upon. We should protect at least the wife's part of the property because, for women, they have hardly any influence over what's being done. We should really protect family life that way by protecting their property. So that's what a lot of states then decide to do. So this is an overview of all the different law changes that took place in the US South in the 1840s. A couple of states did not introduce anything, like Arkansas, Georgia, Virginia. Other states like Louisiana and Texas were already under kind of Spanish law, at least in part, and already had legal mechanisms to protect the wife's property. But other states really did introduce new legislation. So the first one here is Florida, but other states like Kentucky, Mississippi, Alabama, North Carolina, Tennessee, they all follow. And they really, what they do is for newly wedded couples, so for new marriages, they protect at least a significant share of the wife's assets. That means assets that the wife owns at the time of marriage, but also all the inheritance or gifts that she would get from her family afterwards. That's basically being shielded off from the husband's creditors. The husband holds it in trust, supposed to invest it for the wife's benefit, but cannot be seized by creditors. Okay, so how then do we think that the passage of these laws changed the equilibrium in the marriage market? So I'm going to walk you through a theoretical model where we kind of model this out, and I'm going to take you step by step. I'm going to build a model basically from scratch to kind of give you a sense of what's going on in the model. So the basis of the model is a model of transferable utility, which is kind of the standard workhorse model people have been using in this literature to think about the marriage market. So what is a transferable utility model? Well, in the transferable utility model, a marriage generates utility, which then can be easily transferred between spouses. So we basically see So what we really care about is the utility that's being generated by a marriage. And then we don't really care about how exactly utility is transferred between husband and wife. We just assume that's possible. To give you a very concrete example, consider two men and two women of two types. We have red women and red men, and blue women and blue men. Now, we're going to have assortative mating, as we call it, if blue marries with blue and red marries with red. That's situation 1 here. And then we have non-assortative mating if red marries blue and blue marries red. That's situation 2. So what kind of matches will occur in equilibrium? Well, that depends on which matches generate the most utility. If the total utility generated by these two marriages is higher in 1 than in 2, then in equilibrium, you will see that we're going to get assortative mating. We're going to be in situation 1. Kind of the intuition here is there's no incentive to deviate from that equilibrium to the other equilibrium and pick another spouse, because that's not going to generate any more utility for either of the two partners. So the only equilibrium is one in which there's assortative mating, because that generates the highest overall utility. Now, that makes it a little bit more realistic. Suppose that marital utility has some kind of systematic component. So red with red or blue with blue is always systematically correlated with, let's say, some higher utility. And there's some idiosyncratic component. It's possible that a particular blue person and a particular red person really like each other and would want to marry each other. Then what you can say is that matches of type 1 are still more likely to occur. So we're going to have all kinds of matches in the equilibrium, but the match between red and red is more likely to occur if the systematic utility from red matching with red is bigger than red matching with blue. That's kind of the baseline transferable utility model. So how do we think about the marriage market in particular? So we think that the gains from marriage consist of 3 elements. There's a gains from investing or consuming your premarital wealth. So you're going to get some assets from your parents, or there's some wealth that you own at the time of marriage. You're going to be able to invest that and consume that. That's going to give you utility. That's one component. The second component is there's some monetary gains of being married, and we're going to assume that these non-monetary gains are correlated with premarital wealth. So it's good for your status, or it's good for other stuff. You may like to marry somebody, let's say, within your own social economic bin, because you kind of share the same preferences, you like to do the same stuff. So there's some non-monetary gains from marriages that we think are correlated with premarital wealth. And then there's some idiosyncratic gains from marriage. It's just you happen to like a particular person. So the way we're going to implement the empirical analysis, and I'll talk more about that when I get there, is that we can really think about the marriage women property law only affecting this U term, this gains from investing and consuming premarital wealth. That's really what the law changes, the way you can use wealth in the marriage, and these non-monetary gains and the idiosyncratic gains are unchanged. At least that's what we're going to try to argue in the empirical analysis. Okay, so consider a hypothetical marriage market of men and women with 2 premarital wealth levels. So we're going to have WMH, that's husband's wealth at marriage, which is high, husband's wealth at marriage, which is low, wife's wealth at marriage, which is high, or wife's wealth at marriage, which is low. So when are we going to get assortative mating, that wealthy marry the wealthy and the poor marry the poor? Well, that's when the utility from a match between high wealth persons and the utility from a match between low wealth persons is higher than the utility, or basically increases relative to the utility generated by a match between a high and low wealth person. So that's these 2 terms here. So the utility from assortative matches increase with respect to the utility from non-assortative matches, then you would expect to see more assortative mating going on in the marriage market. Turns out that mathematically, that's equivalent to saying that the cross derivative of this utility with respect to husband's wealth and wife's wealth increases for all levels of WM and WF. And that's kind of that follows from Becker. So this cross derivative has to increase. What's the intuition? Well, assortative mating is going to be more likely if assortative mating increases kind of the value you get from the marriage. And that happens when WM and WF become more complementary. The moment that 1 plus 1 is more than 2, you would really like rich to marry rich, and then whatever's left, poor would then marry poor. Another reason for why you would want to see why you'd see an increase in assortative mating, apart from its complementarity, is that there might be some gains from smoothing spousal wealth across the marriage market, basically making sure that you don't get too large kind of wealth differences, and then what you get is some benefits of smoothing wealth, which means poor marrying rich and rich marrying poor. Well, if these benefits from the smoothing wealth over couples declines, there would also be a situation in which assortative mating would become more valuable and would be more likely to occur. Both of these things basically mathematically imply that the cross derivative increases. Okay, so that was the marriage market. That's how we think about the marriage market. We have some conditions under which we think that assortative mating would increase or would decline. But then let's think more about these laws. What do they really do at the household level? What changes do they imply? Here I'll fall back on this previous paper that we published. Here the idea is as follows. The household consumes the product of a risky investment, which has positive expected return. So think about a plantation in the south or a small farm in the south. You can invest in that farm. You can invest in that plantation. That's going to return our upper bar, which is going to be larger than 1 if you succeed, if you enter a good state, state G. But if you fail, you're in a bad state, state B, your return is going to be less than 1 and you're losing money. Now, the household owns premarital wealth. That's the stuff they got from their parents, WM plus WF. And on top of that, they can borrow money in credit markets to kind of level up their investment, which typically they would want to do because on average, this project gives them positive expected return. So on average, they will make money. So they would like to invest more and they would like to borrow to be able to invest more. There's some restrictions here in the sense that the household we assume to be risk averse. I mean, model this very simply as a large utility, but more generally think about the household having some concave utility function. They're risk averse. Yes, this project has some positive expected returns, but there's also risk. In a bad state, they lose money and bad stuff might happen, and that's going to affect the amount of money in which they are willing to borrow. So what's going to happen before the passage of a law? Well, before the passage of a law, creditors can seize all the assets in the household. That's a very concrete consequence here. But if they fail in the bad state, the household stands the risk of losing everything because the creditor can seize everything. If they borrow a lot of money and they turn out to be unlucky and enter the bad state, the creditor can come in and seize all their assets, making them extremely poor. And that's really not what we want. So what's going to happen is that they're going to borrow some money in credit markets, but it's not going to be a lot because they want to make sure that even when they're unlucky and they're unable and the project doesn't return a lot, that even in that state, they're able to fully satisfy creditors and still have some money left to consume so that they're not destitute. And wanting to have some money left to consume after having repaid all creditors means that you cannot borrow too much money. After the passage of a law, this is going to change. What's going to happen now is the family has downside protection. Now, if they're in a bad state, the wife's share of the property is protected. The creditors can't seize it, so a family can always rely on these assets. So that means that even if they're unable to repay their loans, they'll just say, okay, sorry, we can't repay these loans. We still have some stuff that creditors can seize, and they'll rely on that for their consumption. So it gives them downside protection, which means that their demand for credit is going to increase. And they're going to be willing to take up a larger, riskier loan. But that obviously is also going to have supply effects, because now creditors realize what's going on. These guys want to borrow lots of money because they're protected in the downside. That means that there are all kinds of agency problems arising that may make creditors really reluctant to lend to these guys. These guys may take too much risk, they may run away with the money, they may do all kinds of crazy stuff because they're protected on the downside. So that means that effectively a family has less collateral to pledge, and that also means that the supply of credit is going to go down. And households can only borrow up in the model, the way we've kind of set things up, households can only borrow up to some multiple of the husband's wealth, which is the only wealth in this case that they can use as collateral. What's going to be the net effect? Well, it depends on how much premarital wealth husband and wife put into the family. If the husband puts in relatively more wealth than the wife, so WM over WF is large, then you would expect these guys to borrow more, invest more, because yes, they have some WF that they can rely on as a buffer, but they also have plenty of WM available to pledge as collateral and borrow. The opposite is going to happen for couples where the wife is relatively rich and this WM over WF is small. Now, most of the assets in the family are owned by the wife or are in the name of the wife, cannot be seized by creditors. And as a result, even though the household would like to lever up and borrow lots of money, they cannot because they immediately run into the collateral constraint and they just don't have enough collateral to pledge to borrow. So that's kind of what this model would predict, is that either demand effects or supply effects dominate depending on how much of assets in the family is protected. If only a moderate amount of assets is protected, so the husband is relatively rich, demand effects are going to dominate. If a large chunk of assets are protected, supply effects are going to dominate, and borrowing is going to go down. Is that really the case? Is that something we made up? Well, actually, if you look at the data, so this is from our 2020 paper, this seems to be what's going on. So here we look in the 1850 census. We look at how much total assets households have. And what we're going to do is we're going to compare folks who got married before and with folks who got married after a law was passed. And this is the net effect of basically a law change. On the horizontal axis, we have the groom share in premarital assets. So that means that on the left side, a lot of assets are protected. The groom share is relatively small. On the right side, only a moderate or small amount of assets are protected because the groom share is relatively large. And what we find is that if you're married after a law is passed and the wife was relatively rich and the groom share is relatively small, these guys end up with much fewer assets. Presumably they borrow less, they can borrow less because of this collateral constraint, and they just don't have that much assets. If you then move to the right, so you're going to protect less of these assets, but there's still some amount of the assets that are still protected, you see an increase in assets. So presumably these guys are borrowing more and they're investing more in their farm or plantation. That's when demand effects dominate. And then if we move all the way to the right, we see that the groom share in premarital assets is really large. At this point, nothing much changes because you only protect really a little bit of assets in the family, and it's really not going to have much of an effect. So basically, we have a zero effect. That's what we find in this other paper. There's kind of a validation for this credit market model that I just laid out. Then the next question is, how does this stuff affect partner choice and assortative mating? Okay, so this is going to have two effects on assortative mating, and two key effects. So first of all, they cause WM and WF to be more complementary. Basically, these two things now specialize in different things. Before they were perfect substitutes from the perspective of the husband. It didn't matter whether it was his money or his wife's money, he just owned everything. But afterwards, WF is really protected. So it's really correlated or really related to the consumption of the household in the bad state of the world. So if they borrow up to their constraint, their bad state of the world consumption is pinned down by this WF, by the wealth standing in the wife's name. And the good state of the world consumption only depends on pledgeable collateral, which is the husband's wealth, WM. So very two complementary things. So that's the first thing that changes. Yeah, and that's going to have an effect on the marriage market. Second thing that's going to happen is that these laws are going to affect the level of good state consumption through the effect on borrowing. Basically, we saw that for some couples, they're not going to borrow more, and they're going to have more good state consumption because they are willing to borrow more money. How is that going to affect stuff? Well, one important thing to note here is that households have concave utility. What does that mean from the perspective of the marriage market equilibrium overall? Well, it means that the overall utility in the marriage market is going to be the highest when consumption is smoothed across couples. That's really coming from this concave utility. You get the highest utility when couples marry that really have a kind of a diversified amount of wealth in the marriage market. On a concave utility, poor marrying poor is going to have much less utility than rich marrying rich. And you're going to get more utility when rich marry poor, poor marry rich. That's on a concave utility. That's going to give you higher utility. That in itself is going to work against assortative mating, the fact that we have this concave utility. Now stuff is going to change as when these laws are passed. So especially the gains from kind of smoothing your spousal wealth is going to decline as your good state consumption grows. Effectively, what happens if you're a couple, your good state consumption grows after the passage of one of these laws. Effectively, as a household, you're becoming richer. And as we know under concave utility, the richer you get, the less important the smoothing type of things are going to be. Kind of the gains from smoothing this wealth across couples is going to decline when you become richer, and kind of your concave utility thing is going to flatten out. On the other hand, if you become poorer, if you're in a part of the wealth distribution where the law forces you to invest less and your good state consumption is going to be smaller, you're going to become poorer. So you're going to go to kind of a steeper part of your concave utility, and now smoothing of utility across rich and poor partners is actually going to have more value. You really like to smooth this wealth across the marriage market more. So what's going to happen here is that there's going to be kind of a heterogeneous effect of these laws on the marriage market. So if your good state consumption is increasing because of these laws, and that happens when husband's wealth is relatively large compared to wife's wealth, you're going to see more assortative mating. That's part of the distribution where the benefits from smoothing are relatively small. When your good state consumption is going to decrease, because, and that happens when the husband's share in total wealth is relatively small, and the wife's wealth, the name of the wife's wealth is relatively large. That's going to lead to less assortative mating. These couples are going to be poorer, and for them, smoothing consumption across households is much more beneficial. We're going to get a heterogeneous effect. Let me try to illustrate this. So this is just a picture. On the horizontal axis, we have the wife's premarital wealth. On the vertical axis, we have got husband's premarital wealth. And this lower area here is going to be an area in which the wife's wealth is relatively large compared to the husband's premarital wealth. And that's going to be an area where you're going to see a decrease in assortative mating. What is that going to mean? So here we have 2 men, 2 women. We have 2 possible allocations in the marriage market along a diagonal: rich marry rich, poor marry poor, or non-assortative: rich marry poor and poor marry rich. And in this area, we're gonna think that these non-assortative matches, so these ones, are going to be much more likely to occur. This area of the distribution over here, we have men that are relatively rich as compared to their women. Their good state consumption is going to increase. They're going to be richer, which means that the benefits from non-assortative mating are going down, and we would expect to see more assortative mating. So here again, 2 men, 2 women. Here we would expect to see a higher likelihood of rich marrying rich and poor marrying poor. Then there's part of the distribution where there's no change. This is a change where this is a part of the distribution where the husband is so rich, or and the wife is relatively so poor, effectively, that the law really doesn't change much, and the allocation is kind of unchanged. The equilibrium is unchanged for that part of the distribution. So that's equivalent to this graph over here. If the husband owns a lot of wealth, a lot of premarital wealth is coming from the husband, then protecting the wife's wealth is really not going to affect him. Okay, so this is the heterogeneity in terms of parts of the different parts of the wealth distribution. So how is it going to look like for the wealth distribution overall? Well, again, this is a similar thing. Here, what we show is what's going to happen with utility, how utility is going to change for particular couples who marry in different parts of the distribution. So, kind of what follows relatively naturally from this discussion we just had is that in this part of the distribution, this lower part, utility for a couple is going down. And this is a part of the distribution where the wife is just relatively too rich as compared to her husband. That means that they're basically rushing out of credit markets. They don't have enough collateral to borrow. They become poorer, so the utility goes down. This part of the distribution, the higher part, this white part, the utility is going up. Now these guys can actually, because of the law, they will be able to borrow more money, they'll be richer, and their utility is going to go up. So what does that mean now for the overall equilibrium in the marriage market? Well, the model doesn't have anything unambiguous to say. Everything I'm going to say here is somewhat speculative, but it seems likely that under this condition, that overall assortative mating is going to go up. Why? Again, let's consider 2 men, 2 women, then they're both in the upper half or the lower half of their wealth distribution. So a woman that's relatively poor in the lower half of the wealth distribution, a woman who's relatively rich, upper half of their her wealth distribution. A husband who's in the lower half, or a husband who's in the upper half of the wealth distribution. Now, and then again, we can have 2 allocations. We can have an assortative allocation where rich marry rich and poor marry poor. Well, for both of these matches, their utility is going to go up. And then we can look at non-assortative matches. So the rich wife marries the poor guy, and the rich guy marries the poor woman. And then at least for one match, utility is going to go up, but for the other match, utility is going to go down. So if these 2 men and women who kind of in the upper or lower part of their wealth distribution are somewhat representative for men and women generally, it looks like you're going to get more utility from an assortative match. So that means that overall you would expect assortative mating to go up. But this is not a general result. It really, in the end, depends on the exact distributions of wealth within men and women. Okay, so to summarize, what are the model's main predictions? The passage of a law affects the gains from assortative mating, and it has a very particular heterogeneous effect. It's going to increase, the gains from assortative mating are going to increase for couples with a relatively high WM and low WF. The husband is relatively rich. It's going to, the gains from assortative mating are going to go down among couples who have a low WM and a high WF, where the wife is relatively rich. That's a very clear effect on heterogeneity, and a more speculative prediction that we'll see an overall increase in the gains from assortative mating for couples taken altogether. Okay, so let's try to measure this. So we have data. We have, first of all, we have marriage records from southern states between 1840 and 1851 that we scraped from FamilySearch.org. We have date and county of marriage. We have first and last names of the bride and groom. So we know when these guys get married and when, and we also have their names. And that's important because what are we going to do next? We have a complete count of the 1840 federal census. That's from ancestry.com. And the 1840 census gives us information at the household level, gives us the name of the household head, but very importantly, gives us the number of people in the household, and also measures and also gives an indication of how many slaves are present in a particular household. So what are we going to do next? We're going to say, look, we're going to take all these individual households in the 1840 census, that's W_I, and we're going to take the log of their slave wealth. So that's the number of slaves that they own according to the census times the average value of a slave in 1840, which happens to be $377. We're going to add $1 and then take the log. That's going to be our measure of wealth at the individual family level in 1840. Then we're going to do the following. We're going to say, well, look, let's look at these marriages that we see between 1840 and 1851. It gives us the last name of the husband, gives us the maiden name of the wife. What we're then going to do is we're going to say, well, if you got married in state S and you have surname J, we're just going to take the average of these log wealths of people who share your surname in that state. So, for example, if you are called Koudijs and you get married in Alabama in 1845, we're going to say, let's take everybody who has the surname Koudijs in Alabama in 1840, and we're going to take the average of this mean. We're going to take the average of the log wealth of everybody who's called Koudijs in Alabama, and that's going to be our proxy for how much premarital wealth a person has who gets married in 1845. And then there's somebody called Salisbury in Georgia in 1845. We're going to do the exact same thing for people with the last name Salisbury in Georgia in 1845. That's our proxy for premarital wealth. It's really surname based on your surname. Obviously, there's noise there. This is an approximation. What we've shown in the previous paper that this correlates relatively well with individual level wealth levels reported in the 1850 census. So yes, we're making a mistake here. There's error here, but we still capture something very reasonable. Okay, so then we have this data. What are we going to do with it? So we're going to define the following statistic for men of types I and K, and women of types J and L. We're going to have this omega statistic, which is the log of the number of marriages between type I and J times the number of marriages between type K and L, divided by the number of marriages between I and L times the number of marriages between K and J. So this is basically how we're going to think about this. The type is really determined, so I and J and K and L is determined by your premarital wealth. And we're going to basically bin people by premarital wealth, and we're going to rank them in descending order. So a low I means that you are relatively wealthy. So then what does this statistic capture? We're going to assume that a match between I and, so basically the number of matches between types I and J are matches that are assortative. It's a match between rich and rich. And a match between K and L is a match between poor and poor. A match between I and L is a non-assortative match between rich and poor, and K and J between poor and rich. So what we're so basically it's the ratio of the number of marriages that are assortative divided by the number of marriages that are non-assortative. And Chu and Co, who in 2006 JP paper, they showed that under certain assumptions, this ratio equals the relative systematic value of assortative matches. So what are we going to say? Well, if omega IJKL increases after the passage of a law, that means that the assortative matching in this particular mini marriage market IJKL have increased relative to non-assortative matches. So let me illustrate this with a figure to make this more clear. So here I'm basically focusing on one particular marriage market. I'm going to consider men from wealth bins 3 and 7, where 3 is richer than in wealth bin 7. And symmetrically, I'm going to consider women in wealth bin 3 and 7 as well. And these are the folks that I consider. They're all getting married, and I just want to know how many marriages do I get between grooms and brides who are both in brides bin 3, and how many matches do I get from grooms and brides who are both in wealth bin 7? Those would be assortative matches. And how many matches am I getting between folks who are in men who are in 3 and brides who are in 7? And how many for when the groom is in bin 7 and the wife is in bin 3? Those would be non-assortative matches. So I'm purely going to count how many marriages do I have in these 4 cells. I'm going to take a product of the matches in the assortative cells. I'm going to take the product of the match, and I'm going to divide that by the number of matches in the non-assortative cells. And then we're going to take the log. And that's going to give my omega. If this omega increases, it means that relatively speaking, I see more assortative matches, meaning that assortative mating is becoming more common. Okay, so more specifically, the empirical approach is as follows. We're going to define a marriage market as all marriages that happen in one state in 1 year. And we're going to divide men and women in each marriage market into capital B premarital wealth bins. And we're going to vary the amount of bins that we consider just to see whether results are robust. Now, in each observation that we have is a combination of two groom bins and 2 bride bins, as I've just shown you in the example. So how many observations do we have? Well, we have 108 marriage markets. So that's the number of states in our sample times the number of years for which we have data. And then we're going to take all the different 2x2 combinations in the grid that are possible, and those and times the number of marriage markets, and that's our number of observations. So that's a lot of observations, as you'll see. And then we're going to estimate this following equation. We're going to estimate these omega IJKLs for all these different 2x2 combinations in the grid for each state, for each individual year, so underscore S underscore T. And we're going to regress that on a dummy, law dummy that says in a particular year, state S has introduced a new marriage law. So they're under the new regime. That's our basic specification. And we throw in a bunch of fixed effects to make sure that we're really focusing on the impact of the law and not some other societal changes or other stuff that's happening in the data. So we're going to have year fixed effects. So we're going to absorb any kind of secular changes in the marriage market or in preferences over time that might occur in the US South. We're going to have state fixed effects, so any differences in preferences or marriage market equilibria between states, we're going to absorb. And then we're going to have fixed effects for the different bins, different wealth bins in which husband and wife are, to make sure that our effect is not driven by any differences between wealth. We're going to have fixed effects for this wealth bin I, J, K, and L. So very much absorbed by fixed effects, so that our law dummy really captures the effect of a law change and not wealth, location, or time. And then we're going to cluster our standard errors at 4 levels: at the state year bin I level, state year bin J level, etc. To make sure that correlation within a bin, within a state and year, is not kind of going to deflate our standard errors. We're basically taking care of any kind of correlation of errors within these bins. Let's put it that way. That's more precise. And then what we're going to do is, for each of these omega JKLs, we're going to weight them by the number of actual observations that are in there. How many total marriages are in this mini marriage? Okay, good. Before going into the full regression, let me give you some very simple economic intuition for what's going on with this data. So here we're doing something very simple. We're going to take the correlation between husbands and wives' premarital wealth per state per year. So the first plot is Alabama, and you can see that the correlation between husbands and wives' premarital wealth, as we measure it, hovers around 0.7, and then changes, at least in the years immediately following the law change. So these are indicated by the crosses here. So after the law has passed, they seem to slightly increase in Alabama, this correlation. That doesn't seem particularly robust, because it goes down a little bit afterwards. Arkansas doesn't implement any of these laws, so we only have round dots. Georgia also doesn't introduce a law, only see round dots. And Kentucky, you can see that right after a law is passed, there seems to be some small increase in the correlation between husbands and wives' premarital wealth. These x's are on average a bit higher than these round circles. Then Mississippi passes a law, some suggestive evidence that overall correlation goes up. North Carolina introduces a law. Here the evidence that correlation is going up is a little bit stronger. Same for Tennessee, and then Virginia doesn't introduce a law. Another way to show you this, much more simply, again for the overall pattern, is I'm just going to show you bin scatters of the wife's premarital wealth and the husband's premarital wealth for couples married before or after a law is passed. Dark dots give you before, gray dots give you after. So in Alabama, you can see that the slope slightly increase, so that the slope after and before is roughly the same, indicating there's no particular change in overall correlation between husbands and wives' wealth. Arkansas, Georgia don't introduce a law. Kentucky, you can see that the slope slightly increases for folks married after a law is passed, so indicating that there's a slightly stronger correlation between husbands and wives' wealth, so more assortative mating. Mississippi, again, a slight increase in the slope. North Carolina, a stronger increase in the slope. Tennessee, also a stronger increase in the slope, indicating that wives' wealth and wives' wealth and husbands' wealth become more strongly correlated, indicative of more assortative mating. We can put that into a regression. So the first panel, very simply, we just take these correlations that I just showed you, put them in a simple differential framework, introducing our state and year fixed effect to absorb anything else that might be going on. And we see a significant positive effect of the post-law dummy on assortative mating, on this correlation between husbands and wives' wealth. We can also split that up in an individual level regression. Left-hand side is the groom's, is the husband's wealth, premarital wealth. And the left-hand side is the women's, the wife's premarital wealth. And there again, you see a kind of an increased kind of relation between these two variables after a law. Let me now, so that's just suggestive that overall there's been an increase in assortative mating. Now let's do our proper thing with this omega IJKL measure and these different wealth bins and see what's going on. Let's focus on the left panel. So we estimate, so this is basically the coefficient on this law dummy on this omega for different samples that have different bin sizes between 4 and 20. And what you can see is that independent of the bin size that you use, you see an increase in, you see positive coefficients indicative that you're seeing more assortative matches after a law change than before. And statistically significant in some of these bins. This is our baseline sample where we're pretty sure we've matched people to the right surname. We also have a larger sample where we kind of positively match people to the 1840 surname. We're not entirely sure we match them to the right surname, but this gives us a bigger sample, but more error. But there we find an increase in the tendency of seeing assortative matches. So we can have different definitions of what is a marriage market. So the first panel gives you the baseline that I just showed you. We can also split it up smaller. We can split up states in 4 state quadrants and define a marriage market as a state quadrant in a particular year. We can also do state halves, either north-south or east-west partition. Whatever you do, you kind of get an overall increase in assortative mating. Okay, fine. But our model didn't have much to say about, or our model had suggestive, more speculative predictions about what should happen with assortative mating for the sample overall. The model really had stronger implications for what would happen in different subsections, subsamples of the marriage market. This heterogeneity that I talked about. Basically, what we talked about is that if we have if we have matches between rich men and poor women, for that part of the joint wealth distribution, we should see more assortative mating. For these type of people, we should actually see more assortative mating because these folks get richer. The benefits from smoothing premarital wealth over couples goes down, and assortative mating should go up. What we also discussed is that couples that have a poor man and a relatively rich woman, they should see an increase. They should see a decrease in assortative matching. These guys, because of the law change, become poorer, and for them, the benefits of smoothing premarital wealth across couples is going to go up. So in that part of the joint wealth distribution, you should see a decrease in assortative mating. And the model doesn't have much to say about stuff along the diagonal. Rich men, rich women, poor men, poor women. Basically, there's not a big change in borrowing, presumably for these couples. And we also don't expect to see a big change for these couples in terms of matching. It's really confined to the second and third quadrant of the joint wealth distribution. So what we're going to do next is we're going to define our marriage markets as being in one of these 4 quadrants of the relative wealth distribution. And then within these 4 quadrants, we're going to see is there an increase or a decrease in assortative matching. And for this analysis, we're not going to consider any matches that cross quadrants. We're going to only look at matches within a quadrant. So it's really kind of really partial equilibrium effect, if you will, but it allows us to test these very specific predictions from our model. So these are the different quartiles, and consistent with what we would expect in this quartile, where you have rich men with poor women, we see an increase in assortative matches. And in this quartile, where we see poor men matching with richer women, we see a decrease in assortative matches. That's consistent with our model, and the difference between the 2 quartiles, it's not here, but that's statistically significant. The more assortative matching when men are relatively rich, the less assortative matching when women are relatively rich. Now, we can do a bunch of things. We can again have divide up the states in different quarters. Now we're going to have states in different quarters, wealth distribution in different quarters. To rerun this regression, we have less statistical power because we're slicing the data really thin now. But again, we find a positive effect for rich men with poor women and a negative effect on assortative matching for poor men and rich women. Not much happening along the diagonal, which is what we would expect because our model didn't have much to say. Okay, good. So I have 10 minutes left. What I'll do in the final 10 minutes is I'll try to talk you through a couple of alternative explanations for these changes in the marriage market. So just to summarize what I've shown you so far, I've shown you that that these laws seem to have led to an overall increase in assortative mating in the marriage market in the US South. And in particular, parts of the joint husband and wife wealth distribution, where men are relatively rich as compared to women, we saw an increase in assortative mating, but we saw a decrease in assortative mating in parts of the wealth distribution where women are relatively wealthy as compared to men. Very much consistent with the theoretical model that I've shown you. Now, a couple of other alternative explanations for these facts. Now, I'm going to try to argue that even though I can come up with other reasonable explanations for this overall increase in assortative mating in response to this law change, it's really hard to come up with a reasonable alternative explanation that gives you this heterogeneous effect. It's really this heterogeneous effect that set our model apart from any other type of explanation for these patterns in the data. So let me talk about the first one, moral hazard. It's very well possible that these laws protected women from husband's mismanagement of assets, or, and that's kind of the way we model it, the husband deserting his wife, taking all the money with him. We're going to model the effects of a kind of split, kind of a negative utility shock to the marriage that basically drives husband and wife apart. With probability pi, a couple separates. Before a law was passed, if a couple would just really get a big fight and would separate, the husband would be able to take everything with him, and the wife could only extract a nominal amount from the husband. After the law passed, if this were to happen and it's got a big fight and they would separate, the husband would take his share of the pie, WM, and the wife would still be able to get WF and being able to consume that. Now, if this is what's going on, then you would expect the law to increase gains from assortative mating. Why? Well, the wife's post-separation consumption not only depends on WF, and the husband's post-separation consumption only depends on WM, which means that before WM and WF were basically clear substitutes, but afterwards they become complements. And as I tried to explain before, if a particular variable becomes more complementary, the basic transferable utility model would predict that you get an increase in assortative mating. The overall increase that we see in the data might be driven by this moral hazard channel. However, this does not predict any heterogeneity. This effect on the gains from assortative mating is the same for everyone in the distribution. It's not more for richer or poorer. Bargaining power. So it's possible that these laws change the amount of bargaining power in the marriage. Women presumably got more bargaining power because now they brought in more assets. We're going to model this in a very basic setup based on this QJE paper by Dubke and Tertiel. The idea here is that husband and wife have preferences over their own consumption and their children's consumption. They can allocate resources or their time to produce today or to educate their kids. Produce today gives them consumption today. Educate their kids gives their kids consumption tomorrow. And the idea is that women place more emphasis on their kids' consumption, and they have a stronger preference for sending their kids to school and let them have an education. Husband, less so. Now, in the model, the couple cannot commit to a particular resource allocation when they're kind of bargaining in the marriage market. They cannot commit to anything, but they can anticipate that a particular bargaining is going to lead to a particular outcome and to a particular amount of utility. And we assume that there's some utility transfers pre-marriage that allow the marriage market to clear, where people take these exposed bargaining outcomes into account. Think about the decision where to settle and what profession to settle, whether to stay close to one parent, move to another state, etc., etc. Those are ways to kind of transfer upfront. Those are ways for these upfront utility transfers to take place. And then finally, the bargain when they get married, bargaining power really depends on the ownership of property. What's going to be the effect of the law? Well, before a law is passed, the husband owns all the property. He has all the bargaining power, so he's just going to pick the education for his kids that he prefers. Afterwards, husband and wife share bargaining power, and his education choice is going to be different. When is utility going to be maximized? Well, if you have some kind of concave utility, then the point where the total utility to husband and wife is the largest is the point where husband and wife are equally rich, have the same amount of bargaining power, and the education decision of their kids is really the consensus of the two partners. That's going to give you the largest utility to both parts. It gives you the largest total utility for the two partners. That's kind of because of the concave utility function. And that's going to give you the largest post-law utility gains. So that means that after a law is passed, you're going to get most utility in the marriage market is people with the same WM and WF marriage. So more assortative mating. Again, the increase in assortative mating could be explained by the bargaining power model. Again, this model does not have any heterogeneous effects. This heterogeneity defined in the data is not in this model. So then finally, laws may change parental wealth transfers. Maybe they would prefer, parents would maybe prefer after passage of a law to consume less and pass on more transfers to their daughters, because their daughters are now protected from this law, by this law. And because of that, women become richer, overall couples become richer, and you're going to see an increase in assortative mating. That's possible. However, the heterogeneity effects that this model produces will be opposite to what we find in the data. The concern is really, the husband could run away with the money. Now the law is being passed. Now, if I pass on money to my daughter, it's going to be more protected. I would expect that women with richer, that couples with richer wives would get more money from their wife's parents. But actually, our effects are the opposite. It seems that couples where the husband is relatively rich become richer and have more assortative mating. So that seems to go in the opposite direction. So that doesn't seem to work. At least the heterogeneity. And then finally, is it possible that states that pass laws were actually the most hard hit states, and that's the endogeneity drives some of our results? Well, again, we think that overall that should lead to less assortative mating, because if a state is really hard hit and is more likely to pass a law, it means that our measure for premarital wealth for husband and wife in these states, because they were hit by this crisis, are less informative of their true premarital wealth. And therefore, it's a worse measure of their premarital wealth. That would suggest that a law passage is associated with less assortative matching, as we're basically making a bigger error in assigning premarital wealth level. Okay, let me conclude. So what do we find? We found an overall increase in assortative mating in response to these Married Women Property Act. But that overall increase masks very important heterogeneity in different parts of the joint husband and wife wealth distribution. And that heterogeneity, as I tried to explain, is consistent with this credit market channel. So that suggests that, at least historically, combining capital and the interaction with credit markets was an explicit motive for marriage. This interaction with credit markets affected partner choice in this market, leading either to more or less assortative mating, depending on where you were in the relative wealth distribution. So pooling of capital, credit markets seem to matter for marriage choice. So that then opens up a couple of questions for future research. If this is all true, this has really interesting implications that might be worth testing. So first question is, you have modern institutions, innovations in credit markets, rules for limited liability, have these things created substitutes for marriage? Before people marry to limit their liability or pool capital, we have institutions that can accomplish the same thing. Is that going to have an effect on the marriage market? And then by extension, is there then a link with long-run patterns in the marriage markets that we see? We basically see over time falling marriage rates and that kind of changing nature of marriage. To what degree are we able to link these things to innovations in credit markets and rules for limited liability? Okay, I'll end here. Thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to the discussion and any questions or comments that you guys might have.
Thank you, Peter. Well, thank you very much, Peter. Very amazing paper showing us the power of finance in shaping the marriage market. Okay, so now let's turn to our discussion session. Today we will have Andrew Sinclair. He is our assistant professor of finance in Hong Kong University. And meanwhile, Professor Zhu Chen will also join the discussion. So Andrew, you can spend 10 or more minutes to discuss Peter's presentation now.
All right, thanks very much, Chi-Chung and Professor Chen for inviting me to discuss this paper. Peter, thanks very much for presenting it. It's a very interesting paper. I really like it. I really think it's an important paper. For me personally, I'm very interested in the role of institutions and how individuals interact with these institutions, and in particular, how people endogenously interact with the institutions and how that affects essentially the structure of society. So, in this paper, one of the big questions is, why does marriage exist? Like why do people get married? And of course, people get married for love, but the main economic reason that people get married is for resource pooling and risk sharing. Resource pooling and risk sharing, this is one of the fundamental drivers of human behavior. Every single human that exists is risk averse. Every single human that exists hates risk, and they want to get rid of this risk. They want to share that risk. And as we know from finance, pooling assets together, getting rid of systematic or idiosyncratic risk is a very powerful tool for doing that. So, the main purpose that marriage exists, the main purpose that the institution of marriage exists, is to provide resource pooling and risk sharing. But this is such a fundamental aspect of human need. There's such a huge demand for it that the institution of marriage is not the only institution that exists. If you think about the church, if you think about the state, if you think about financial markets, all three of these play a huge role in providing resource pooling and risk sharing. If you think about the church, a church member, if their family gets sick, the church will help them out. If they lose their job, the church will provide support. The church will provide alms. Even in terms of risk, in terms of resource pooling, though, if you think about the church, if you think about the fact that people interact in the church every single day or every single week at least, that interaction helps reduce information asymmetries. It helps build trust, and it helps allows for resource pooling to take place. If you think about the state, they come and they tax all of us. They take that money, and what do they do with it? They provide social benefits. They provide social security. They provide welfare. They provide old age insurance. But the state also has a huge role to play in resource pooling as well. They take that money and they also use it for the provision of public goods, the types of goods that can't be financed in a free market. And then finally, financial markets, the whole point of a financial market is to buy and sell risk. The whole point is to hedge risk. And we've seen a huge expansion of financial markets over the past 200 years. 200 years ago, if you think about the dominant business form at the time, it was a private partnership. So in the US 200 years ago, you'd have businesses where 2 or 3 people would get together, they'd pool their assets together, and they'd start a business. So the capital base of companies was relatively small. But now, publicly traded companies, they can raise money from thousands of investors. The capital base is absolutely huge. For financial markets, they really have changed a lot over the past 200 years. They really have this huge resource pooling and risk sharing benefit. And so if you think about over the past 200 years, how these have changed, the state didn't always provide welfare. The capital markets or finance was not nearly as well developed. But as it's been developed, we can see that individuals respond to these developments. They respond to the development, and it changes how they interact with other institutions. So, for example, with the institution of marriage or with the institution of the church. For me, when I was a kid, my parents would bring me to church every single week. I'd go to church every week for 18 years. And on my 18th birthday, I said to my mother, I said, "Mom, I don't want to go to church anymore. I'm done with this." And my brothers, they followed suit. In my family, for hundreds of years, we went to church, and then all of a sudden, it stopped. And my experience is not unique in a sense. If you look in the United States, from 1990 to 2018, church membership decreased from 70% down to 50%. That's a 20 percentage point decrease in church membership. The institution of the church has lost 60 million members in the United States in a 28-year period. And if you look at the marriage market in the United States, the decrease the decreasing role of the marriage, of the institution of marriage is equally surprising. From 1990 to 2018, marriage rates in the US decreased by 33%. Young people, they're looking at the institution of the church, they're looking at the institution of marriage, and they're asking about the value proposition. What does this do for me in terms of risk sharing and resource allocation? And they see that the value proposition just doesn't make sense. You know, if you look at the financial markets, we've seen a huge expansion of financial market participation. You know, most people that you know probably have some investments in mutual funds, but mutual funds didn't exist 60 years ago. You know, mutual funds went from almost nothing to being the dominant form of retirement savings. You know, for most people, they've chosen with their feet or with their dollars, I guess, to engage in the financial market as a risk sharing and resource pooling institution. And so I think, you know, in your paper, the really interesting thing is that you have a financial market innovation. You know, this law, in my mind, I interpret it as a financial market innovation. Most finance is essentially laws and contracts, right? And what this law does is it allows women essentially, or it gives them more rights over their assets. You know, it allows them, in a financial innovation sense, to achieve more Arrow-de-Bruce states of the world. So in that sense, it is a financial innovation. And what you can see is that through that financial innovation, it has an impact on their decisions in other markets, in their decision in how they use the marriage market to share risks and to do resource pooling. And so the results that you find, you know, 170 years ago, I think the really interesting thing is that these sort of forces, you know, they're still at play. I think the idea of how financial innovation can affect the marriage market, it's a huge question, because it is literally shaping our society right now. You know, the financial innovation, how this has changed the structure of society, it's not completed yet. You know, we're still sort of in the throes of it. If you look at the trends for marriage, if you look at the trends for church attendance, you know, these have been consistently going down. And so, you know, to understand where we are, to understand where we're going, I think understanding how individuals sort of not just interact between different institutions, but how they substitute away from institutions, I think is incredibly important. And that's why I think, you know, your paper, you know, by demonstrating that, you know, essentially financial innovation that allows women more access to finance, ends up increasing assortative matching in the marriage market. Like that's a huge result. It also has very important implications. You know, I was thinking about like sort of the basic model. You know, if you have a model where wealth has this complementarity, but also smoothing wealth across families has decreasing returns to scale, then actually you have a sort of more general result. Like you could have a result that says that when women have more access to finance, it generally leads to more assortative matching. And then the implication of that is potentially very huge. You know, the implication of that, like the implication of more assortative matching, that speaks to the current problems that we have about income inequality. You know, assortative matching essentially will cause long-term persistence in dynastic wealth across families. And so I think, you know, these are the types of financial history papers I like the best, because, you know, they teach us something about the way the world was in the 19th century, but they also are very informative to the way the world currently is and to the way the world is going. So yeah, Peter, thanks very much. I really appreciated the talk.
Thank you, Andrew. So Peter, would you like to respond now?
Yeah, I can respond now. Well, thanks a lot for your comments, Andrew. They're very kind and very constructive. So no, I think I completely agree with what you're saying, and I really like the way how you frame it from a bigger picture point of view. So I think that's super helpful. I'm sure that's going to make its way in the next draft. So thanks a lot for that. That's really helpful. I think what your comments suggest, at least when I think about it for a little bit, is that there's much more that we can do with this type of work. Right now, it's really kind of what we're focusing on in the paper is a very particular law change, and it's all well identified. So we hopefully have some confidence that the effects that we find are well identified. But there are larger, kind of longer time horizon effects taking place in terms of how financial markets have developed or how the government has developed, as you indicate. And figuring out how that affects marriage market equilibria over the longer run, I think is a really interesting and really valuable research agenda. So I'm wondering whether there's something we could do in this paper, or whether it's more for kind of future work, that there's kind of more aggregate stuff that we might be able to do, looking at the impact of these type of innovations in this case in the marriage market. So that's or innovations in financial markets. So this is super, this is super helpful. So I just want to thank you a lot for this. This is great. Thank you.
Oh, welcome. Yeah, I mean, I understand the tension because, you know, on the one hand, you need to have something that's well identified, right? But then as you do something that's well identified, it sort of narrows in the scope. But you know, I think there is a sort of more general result here. You know, I think that's again what worked for a different paper, or you know, maybe even like a book at some point.
Yeah,
but I think, you know, I think this is a very important paper. Yeah.
No, thank you. That's awesome. Thanks a lot.
Okay, thank you both. So I think Professor Chen may want to say something because he has been working on a related issue, but in the context of China, about the relationship between finance and Chinese family institution, especially the Confucian clans. So Professor Chen, would you like to say something?
Thank you, Zhishen. Thank you, Peter, for the presentation. I've spent many years on the history of human marriage and looking at this from various perspectives. I'm just curious, you know, for the particular laws that were passed in the different states in the 19th century. I would have thought the outcome would be the opposite, in the sense that these laws provided more protection to rich women. So as a result of that, that should free up the rich women from engaging in assortative mating. Right? They would be freed up because their own premarital assets would be protected by the new laws. So for those women with assets, they should be more open, more interested in looking for mates who may be rich or who may not be rich. The appeal or the downside risk to the rich women would be somewhat minimized. So they would not have to be afraid of poor men looking up to them simply because of their wealth. And then likewise, for the rich men, as well as for poor men, I guess, initially before the laws, they would be able to just try to find the rich marriage partners because of their wealth. But after the new laws, then the attraction of rich women to them would just go down. So that presumably should open up the marriage search to include both rich and very poor women as far as the men be concerned. So I thought the non-assortative mating would be more likely to happen instead of the other direction. You know.
Right. So no, that's a fair comment. And the way we've been trying to think about these issues is that when you think about the marriage market, right? You're thinking about it's a general equilibrium, right? So that's why this transferable utility framework is so useful, because the equilibrium is going to be one that generates the highest utility for everybody, for overall matches. And that means that when you think about an institutional change like this, you need to consider how attractiveness of partners, how that changes for everybody. So take the example of rich women. So they have more money now. and that's better protected. That means that to some degree, that's true for all women, both them marrying with rich men and with poorer men. So what this is what we've been thinking about is you need something to change their marriage patterns. You need something that changes the productivity of a match between rich and rich and poor. We think the credit market channel is very natural here. Now, having said that, kind of we do find that for rich women, for women who are relatively rich, actually for them, the non-assortative mating does increase, right? That's one of these heterogeneous effects. So so for the group of for kind of the sub-marriage market between rich women and rich and relatively poor men, we do see a decline in non-assortative mating. We relate that to the credit market. I have to think very carefully about whether some kind of model where the risk of being expropriated by your husband depends somehow on the wealth level of the husband, whether that could generate a similar result. Honestly, I need to think more about that. That's a fair point.
Yeah.
About the men to finish the thought. So about the men marrying the richer women, whether wealth doesn't become less attractive to them because they can't use it. Well, that's only partly true, right? Because what's nice about these marriage laws is that the women's wealth is basically protected from the creditors. But to some degree, the wife's wealth actually becomes more productive for these guys. They get more out of it because before it was just another dollar that they could invest, but they already had a lot of dollars themselves. But all these dollars were at risk from being seized by creditors. Now they're getting dollars that they can use to protect themselves. I didn't emphasize this in the talk, but divorce is very rare at this point. So they always get, as long as they behave properly, they'll always be able to rely on this money as some kind of downside protection, some nest egg that they have that they can rely on. To some degree, for these men, actually attractiveness of rich women improves in the model and also consistent with the stuff in the data.
I was just thinking that maybe something else may have contributed to that besides the creditor not being able to grab the wife's premarital assets, and also linking this with what Andrew was saying earlier. I mean, overall today, of course, in the US especially, non-assortative mating frequency must have increased quite significantly, especially relative to the mid-19th century, at least in America and maybe in many of the European countries. Not many women or men would really just to try to marry up in terms of wealth. But of course, today in China, that's the opposite. So many women would look for a very rich man to get married to, and so on. So I think something else must be going on. Maybe the laws you're focusing on and many other developments, especially maybe financial developments, have contributed to the rise or the emergence of the opposite trend. That is to go from assortative mating to non-assortative mating. But even though in the short run, over your sample period,
right,
you have experienced the opposite.
Okay.
Yeah, no, that's a fair point. I think over the longer run, this goes back to my comment to Andrew. This is somewhat the localized effect, right? Relatively well identified, but short run, emphasizing the importance of a particular channel. This kind of more secular trends, to what degree they're correlated with, let's say, innovations in financial markets, that remains to be an open question. So I think that's a fair point. That's not something we'll be able to comment on very clearly in this paper, but that's something to keep in mind. That's right.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Professor Chen. Thank you, Peter. Now we have our third discussant. We have Professor Chen Lin in our panelist. Professor Lin is our chair and professor of finance in Hong Kong University. So he will also discuss. So Professor Lin, please go ahead.
Yeah, Susan, I'm not a formal discussion. I just have a couple of quick comments. I understand the time. So again, first, Peter, this is a wonderful paper, and needlessly say, and I totally agree with Andrew the importance of paper. There's one related paper that comes up into my mind, which is a 2018 AER paper by Swan Anderson. That in that paper, basically, he or she look at how this the property laws in Sahara Africa, basically the legal oranges, because in common law and versus civil law, they have a the females wells are protected in a different way, and how does that affect the HIV infection rate? So the basic idea was like basically is actually the bargaining power story you were talking about. So in the common law, countries, because the female are less protected by this property law, so it's difficult for them to say no to this unprotected sex. So that's why the infection rate is higher. So I was thinking about, so when I listened to your presentation, that this is the story that comes up into my mind. So I was thinking about whether, because you show that, it's very brief, right? You said, look, the bargaining story should lead to a high assortative mating, but there's no heterogeneity. So I was just thinking about it. I don't have time to think through the model, but I was thinking about just following Zhu's point. If you think about a rich female versus a poor female, they might have different incentive, right? So I mean, because if a rich female, when they got married, so maybe before they got married, they have a higher social status versus the grooms, so but after that things might switch, but if relative speaking, the female is much poorer than a groom, then it's not a law. The law has a small impact on this, right? Because relative speaking, their social status within the family didn't really change. So I was thinking about this, so again, because you went through this in a very brief way, I couldn't think through about this, but I would love to hear more about this. This is the first question. The second question I had is that when I look at the law you were presenting, some of the law was defined the property based on the pre-marriage, property, right? So I mean, some of the law also categorized the property the female acquire after marriage into this into the law. So I think this might have different implications, right? So if you think that in the latter point, that if the law can, if the asset acquired by the female after marriage can be categorized into the law, into the protection of the law, then there might be some strategic default, right? So if for a family, so the husband can actually shift some of the asset to the female, and then take excessive risk, and then enjoy the limited liability. So this kind of strategic default, whether there is any kind of financial implication on this, again, I haven't thought through about this. I want to listen more on this. Okay, thank you very much.
So thanks a lot for this question. Let me take the second question first. So that's a great question, and that's a big concern, right? So the concern you have in mind is that after you get married, you basically, as a husband, you switch you put your assets in the wife's name, then you borrow like crazy, and then they come after you and try to seize your assets. And they say, well, they're not my assets, they're my wife's assets, please go away. Mm-hmm. That's a big concern. And when legislators write down these laws, this is something they're very aware of. So basically what the law states is that property that the wife got from her husband can never be protected. Actually, how they put it is that a wife needs to prove that the property that's in her name, that she acquired that in a way that's in no way related to her husband. And I can go on for centuries about the details here. But what it boils down to is that the stuff that she owned at the time of marriage, that was in her name already at that point, or the stuff that she gets from her parents or family, or inherited from her family, that's very clearly outside of the husband's scope, and that's protected. But if there's a piece of property that she cannot prove that she may have gotten from her husband, is not protected. So this is your concern, is one that legislators also had. Like, if we pass these laws, are we just going to completely kill credit markets altogether, because people are going to strategically shift all their assets all the time to get to make sure they don't have to repay their debts. And so this was they try to, at least on paper, they try to deal with this.
Okay.
And I've seen legal cases that that are consistent with the law being enforced in this particular way. Okay, so that was the second question. Then the first question, which is an important question, which is about bargaining power, right? If I if I can summarize your concern, your question is to say, well, bargaining power might change differently for women who are richer than for women who are poorer. And that's exactly. I don't have time to go through this model in detail because it's going to take too much time. It's going to be like 15 minutes. But that's part of our model. That's the way we model it. And the key point of our model is that people, when they get married, they take this difference in bargaining power into account, and they kind of do backward induction, and they figure out, well, if that's the bargaining power I have in the marriage, then this is the allocation that I'll get in the marriage. How much? In this case, we model it through education, but you could do it for any kind of preferences over different type of stuff. If I know in ex ante that that's the exposed outcome I'm going to get with the amount of bargaining power I have, so more for rich women, less for poor women, then that's going to generate a particular utility from this marriage, and that's then what's going to drive the matching. And if you model it that way, what you'll get is that everybody's going to be happiest if everybody is matched to somebody of equal wealth. Why? That means that your bargaining power will be really well balanced in the marriage. So that's poor with poor, poor with rich. That's kind of in equilibrium. In equilibrium, that gives you the highest utility because in every single couple is going to implement the consensus. Everybody has 50% say in the marriage, so they're going to come up at the exact consensus. You're going to arrive at kind of a corner solution where either you do what the husband wants, or either you're going to do what the wife wants. You're going to be in the middle, and that on average is going to make everybody happy. That's what this model would predict. And then when you think about heterogeneity, there's really not much there, because basically in every single quadrant of what I've shown you, everybody just wants to move closer to somebody who's more like them, because that's closer to the equilibrium that's going to generate the highest total utility. And it doesn't really matter where you are in these four quadrants, everybody will want to move closer to the diagonal. That's 2 minutes. That's the best I can do.
Okay.
Okay, thank you, Peter. So time's up. Thank you, Peter, for your very wonderful talk. And we do look forward to reading more fascinating work from your side. And thank you, our three discussants. Finally, let me announce the next event for next Thursday. So next week, next Thursday, we will have a webinar. The topic is about Chinese history or political economy of China's long-term development, titled Political Divergence Between East and West in the 8th and 9th century. So the talk will be jointly presented by Professor Claire Yang from Washington University, Seattle, and Professor Yasheng Huang Yasheng from MIT. So we do look forward to see you again next week. And thank you again for your listening and the support for our Quantitative History webinar. Okay, so thank you again, Peter, and see you next week.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks everybody who listened, and thanks a lot to the discussants. This was great.
Okay,
thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Peter.
Bye.
Everyone.